Folks, like I said, we got an all-star lineup, and right now, Elizabeth Murray is going to be kicking off that all-star lineup. Get ready for the day the world was deceived, a CIA insider story of 9/11.
Thank you very much, Jason. As Jason said, my name is Elizabeth Murray. I was a CIA political and military analyst for 27 years. After that, I retired and immediately went into the peace movement. I went into nuclear resistance at the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action, and that's all I've done is work on peace, and I'm also active on the Gaza issue and a number of other issues. I also want to say that I'm so honored to be among this distinguished audience and very distinguished speakers. So thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure to be among you. On September the 11th, 2001, I was inside CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia. I happened to be on a rotational assignment to the National Intelligence Officer for warning on the second floor. And I was called over that morning to look at the television, and I was there when the second plane, or apparently a second plane, hit one of the World Trade Center towers. So we later learned that morning that the Pentagon had been hit. And you can just imagine what my colleagues and I were thinking in terms of which building was probably next on the list to be hit. So the nerves were running high. And our boss then told us that there was going to be an evacuation of our building, which gave me considerable relief until I learned that, well, what was I thinking? Just because I was on the second floor didn't mean I would be out soon. Of course, the evacuation started from the 7th floor, which is, of course, where the CIA director's office is and all the big mucky mucks. So it seemed like an eternity before finally it was our turn to very, very slowly get out. And of course, like everyone else that day, you know, our heads and eyes were turned skyward, looking for flying objects heading in our direction. So it was quite the day, and I'm sure many of you went through something similar. So that was where I was on that day. A colleague of mine knew that the roads were going to be very, very jammed that day with everyone going home. So he suggested we meet at a local pub called McKeever's, which is in McLean. It's just down the road from Langley, and it's a very well-known CIA spook hangout. So we went to McKeever's, and of course, every single television station was playing on a continuous loop, you know, this destruction of the towers. And you can imagine viewing that over and over again, combined with copious numbers of alcoholic drinks. And plus the trauma and shock of feeling like you just narrowly escaped being one of the victims. You know, you can imagine how that was frying everyone's brains. So it was just a really bizarre afternoon. And I recall something that Graham McQueen said in one of his presentations, and I quote, "If you are an uncritical flag waver, then you can be manipulated into anything." And I mention that just because I wanted to say a little anecdote. Right after 9/11, I had scheduled already a trip to Rehoboth Beach. And I remember on my drive there, every single home had an American flag outside, and more than one usually. And of course, there was almost instantaneous hatred for anyone who even looked Middle Eastern or Muslim. And of course, as you know, lots and lots of innocent people were rounded up very quickly. Anyone, you know, that Sikhs with turbans, and anyone that sort of was a different color than Caucasian was immediately guilty. So it was really a frightful time in this country, filled with very strange symbols and almost universally strange behavior. And I remember wondering to myself, you know, what is happening to our country? And inside the agency, I saw that transformation. It was very disturbing. Very quickly, everything became very militarized. The atmosphere was very pro-torture. If you expressed even the slightest bit of dissent about what was happening at Guantanamo or what was happening in Abu Ghraib, people thought you were unpatriotic or even a traitor. It wasn't long before I started seeing bumper stickers on the back of cars in the CIA parking lot that said terrorist hunting license. This was the sort of atmosphere that I was forced to work in. And suddenly, you know, Fox News was blaring all the time, even in offices as you were trying to get work done. And I think people noticed that I wasn't with the program. And so I was immediately, or not immediately, actually, it was later on, I was banished to the back of the office and given sort of very menial jobs, because at the time, if you dared raise your voice about anything, you know, people wondered, you know, what about your loyalty to the country. So I really feel like all these symbols and all these continuous bombardment of this event over and over again was purposeful invocations of triggering events and triggering thoughts. And also they were controlling our minds through the language they used. And with all good propaganda, this language had to be introduced gradually over time and repeated over and over again. And as you know, this was all carried out by the corporate mainstream media. So most of you know this, but I will just list a few of these words, trigger words, that help to sort of solidify in people's minds the false claims about the 9/11 attack. Pearl Harbor, of course, was one of them. And as pointed out by David Ray Griffin and others, the term was used in September 2000 in the Project for the New American Century report, Rebuilding America's Defenses. Its neocon authors argued that the U.S. would not be able to attack Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, etc., absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Coincidentally or not, the film Pearl Harbor, made with Pentagon assistance, was released on May 25, 2001, and was a box office hit. It was in theaters throughout the summer. The thought of an attack on Pearl Harbor, not a surprise to the U.S. government, but presented as such back in the day, was in the air, despite the fact that the 60th anniversary of that attack was not until December 7th, 2001, a more likely release date. But once the September 11th attacks occurred, the Pearl Harbor comparison was plucked out of the social atmosphere and used innumerable times. Even George W. Bush was reported to have had the time to allegedly use it in his diary that night. And the word homeland, the strange un-American term homeland, another World War II word associated with Nazi Germany, was also used many times by the neocon authors of Rebuilding America's Defenses. I doubt any average American used this term before 9/11. Of course, it became the moniker and part of the name of the Department of Homeland Security, marrying home with security to form a comforting name that simultaneously and unconsciously suggests a defense against Hitler-like evil coming from the outside. Not coincidentally, Hitler introduced the word homeland into Nazi propaganda vernacular at the 1934 Nuremberg rally. Both usages conjure up images of a home besieged by alien forces intent on its destruction. Thus, preemptive action was necessary. Ground zero. This is a third World War II, the good war term, first used at 11:55 a.m. on September 11th by Mark Walsh, AKA the Harley guy, because he was wearing a Harley-Davidson t-shirt, in an interview on the street by Fox News reporter Rick Leventhal, who was identified as a freelancer. Walsh also explained the Twin Towers collapse in a precise, well-rehearsed manner that would be given the same illogical explanation later given by the government, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was too intense. Ground zero, a nuclear bomb term first used by U.S. scientists to refer to the spot where they exploded the first nuclear bomb in New Mexico in 1945, became another trigger word adopted by the media that suggested that a nuclear attack had occurred or might in the future if the U.S. didn't take action. And of course, we all remember what Condoleezza Rice stated on September the 5th, 2002, the following year, quote, "We don't want the smoking gun to become a mushroom cloud." So this again is just further examples of how they were playing with the minds of the American public and triggering past traumas and not letting them die. So you can imagine what this was doing in terms of, banishing any doubts in the minds of most Americans. So the nuclear scare was raised again by the administration, and conjoining the term nuclear with ground zero served to raise the fear factor dramatically. Ironically, the project to develop the nuclear bomb was called the Manhattan Project and headquartered at 270 Broadway in New York, just a few short blocks north of the World Trade Center. The unthinkable. This is another nuclear term whose usage as a linguistic mind control and propaganda is analyzed by Graham McQueen in the penultimate chapter of the 2001 Anthrax Deception. He notes the patterned use of this term before and after September 11th, while stating that the pattern may not signify a grand plan. It deserves investigation and contemplation. He then presents a convincing case that the use of this term couldn't be accidental. He notes how George W. Bush, in a major foreign policy speech on May the 1st, 2001, quote, gave informal public notice that the United States intended to withdraw unilaterally from the ABM treaty. Bush said the U.S. must be willing to rethink the unthinkable. This was necessary because of terrorism and rogue states with weapons of mass destruction. The project for the New American Century paper also had argued that the U.S. withdraw from the ABM treaty. Right. So once the September 11th attacks occurred, Bush rethought the unthinkable and officially gave formal notice on December 13th to withdraw the United States from the ABM treaty. Graham McQueen specifies the many times different media used the term unthinkable in October 2001 in reference to the anthrax attacks. He explicates its usage in one of the anthrax letters, the unthinkable. He explains how the media that used the term so often were at the time unaware of its usage in the anthrax letter, since that letter's content had not yet been revealed, and how the letter writer had mailed the letter before the media started using the word. He makes a rock-solid case showing the U.S. government's complicity in the anthrax attacks, and therefore in those of September 11th. I am reminded of Orwell's point in 1984, again, a reference to the unthinkable, a heretical thought, that is, a thought diverging from the principles of Ingsoc, should be literally unthinkable, at least as far as thought is dependent on words, end quote. And then just the term 9/11. This is a key term because, we all know what number we dial for emergencies, 911. The Iraq War promoter, Bill Keller, who at the time was the future editor of the New York Times, wrote an op-ed piece in the Times called America's Emergency Line, 9/11. The linkage of the attacks to a permanent national emergency was thus subliminally introduced, as Keller mentioned Israel 9 times and 7 times compared the U.S. situation to that of Israel as a target for terrorists. The first sentence of his op-ed reads, quote, "An Israeli response to America's aptly dated wake-up call might well be, now you know." by referring to September the 11th as 9/11, an endless national emergency became wed to an endless war on terror aimed at preventing Hitler-like terrorists from obliterating us with nuclear weapons that could create another ground zero or Holocaust. It is a term that pushes all the right buttons, evoking unending social fear and anxiety. It is language as sorcery and sophistry. It is propaganda at its best. Even those who dissent from the official narrative continue to use the term that has become a fixture of public consciousness through endless repetition. As George W. Bush would later put it, as he connected Saddam Hussein to 9/11 and pushed for the Iraq War, we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. So in other words, all of this were ingredients for the perfect linguistic mind control cocktail for the American people. So we really shouldn't speak of 9/11 because we're using these propaganda, it's a propaganda term. We should just refer to it as the attacks of September 11th and not play into this. But, you know, the damage has already been done to the American public, and it may take a lifetime to undo it. Lance DeHaven Smith puts it well in Conspiracy Theory in America. The rapidity with which the new language of the war on terror appeared and took hold, the synergy between terms and their mutual connections to World War II nomenclatures, and above all, the connection between many terms and the emergency motif of 9/11 and 9/11. Any one of these factors alone, but certainly all of them together, raise the possibility that work on this linguistic construct began long before 9/11. It turns out that elite political crime, even treason, may actually be official policy. Now, of course, we don't really need to say may be official policy. Some of us know that it's a little bit more certain than that by now. So the evidence for linguistic mind control does not stand alone, of course. It underpins the actual attacks of September 11th and the subsequent anthrax attacks that are linked to this. The official explanations for these events by themselves do not stand up to elementary logic and are patently false, as proven by thousands of well-respected professional researchers from all walks of life, engineers, pilots, architects, and scholars from many disciplines. To paraphrase the prescient Philadelphia lawyer Vince Celandria, who said it long ago concerning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the attacks of 2001 are a false mystery concealing state crimes. And I have to thank Barbara Honegger for being here, because I'm going to give you a quote from my former boss back when I joined the agency in 1983. His name was William Casey. And he famously said, "We'll know our disinformation campaign is complete when everything the American public believes is false." And the source of that quote, the primary person in the room source, is Barbara Honegger. Thank you, Barbara. That is how we know, thanks to Barbara Honegger, that that quote is true. So if the director, the late director of the CIA actually says openly, or maybe not so openly, that he wants there to be a disinformation campaign to fool the American people and pull the rug over our eyes, then it's not a secret anymore, is it? So, but I also just want to make a comment after that, saying that I see I have 11 minutes left, so I actually have a chance to tell you another anecdote. But I want to conclude this section by giving you my personal opinion about 9/11 truth. It's my belief that if we can open our nation's eyes to the truth about 9/11, then the lies behind the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X will have been exposed, as the same forces were behind those assassinations as well. So that's why this is so important. Now, of course, I lost my papers, but I'll tell you the anecdote off the top of my head. Let's fast forward a few years after 9/11. I was in charge of Iraqi media at the CIA's open source arm, formerly known as the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, now known as the Open Source Center. But one morning, I received a call from the office of then Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz. And this was in early March, or actually maybe late February, early March of 2003, shortly before the US went to war in Iraq. And the question or the request, the tasking from Wolfowitz's office was for me to find confirmation in the Iraqi media of a link and even a meeting between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. So I was able to contact our office in the Middle East and have them go through everything, scour all the media to find any evidence of any kind of contact or meeting. And they did a very thorough job, and there was nothing. And so I went back and confirmed that it was, the answer was negative. Well, the next week, I got another call from the same office, and they had the same request. And I thought, well, maybe I'm missing something. So I did my due diligence, and I had them go and look again. And again, the answer came back no. And when Wolfowitz's office called a third time 2 weeks later, it suddenly hit me that I was just not replying with the proper answer. And they were looking for political, any kind of reasons to sell the Iraq war to the American people. And they desperately needed 9/11 and its bogeyman, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, to be linked together with Iraq to justify that war. And of course, it never happened. And finally, and just kind of the epilogue to this incident was, finally, in frustration, I called Wolfowitz's office and I said, can you please give me the source of this information? It will help me maybe find the answer. And of course, I never heard back from the office. They never called back. And that's just an example, maybe the tip of the iceberg of the type of politicization of intelligence and just shaming of analysts who were trying to do their jobs. And I later learned that interrogators who were interrogating so-called terrorists in various places like Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, they were shamed for they had been tasked with finding the same link. And the common feeling inside the agency was, oh, they're simply not torturing them enough. It was really, really disturbing whenever I would raise questions about, how things were being done. And there was this terrible brainwashing. So what was done, and I would say that the CIA was like a microcosm of the United States. All the brainwashing that was happening to the American people was also happening. And the ugly irony, of course, was that, the elites of the CIA knew darn well what they were doing. And so I appreciate all the work that everyone here is doing. And there should really be a lot of righteous anger for what our government did to us. Thank you very much.